What do you picture when you hear the words Roman legionary? Most likely, the image from popular movies comes to mind. A warrior in shining plate armor, with the eagle of the legion waving proudly in the wind. Disciplined, invincible, part of the greatest war machine in human history that has conquered the world from Britain to the sands of Syria. We think of triumphs, of glory, of roads and aqueducts built over centuries. But it was only a facade, polished by myths and propaganda. Behind the shine of the armor was a reality soaked in sweat, blood, dirt, and despair. The life of an ordinary soldier was not a heroic saga, but a 25-year survival contract that most did not live to see the end of. It was a world where the daily pain of blisters on the feet was worse than the enemy's sword, where hunger and disease took more lives than battles, and the only warmth was often the shoulder of a comrade sleeping next to him in a cramped tent. Their life was harsh and devoid of romance. Endless marching under the scorching sun, meager food, brutal discipline, where for the slightest fault one could lose one's life, and constant proximity to death. Their world was enclosed by the walls of the fort and the horizon on the march. Behind this harsh reality were complex human relationships. In a closed male collective, separated from home for decades, ties emerged that were stronger than kinship. The tent fraternity, 8 soldiers sharing one tent, became a real family. They ate, slept, fought, and died together. They shared not only bread and wine, but also fears, hopes, and secrets. In this environment, where official marriage was forbidden, deep attachments were born, including between men, strong, faithful alliances based on trust and survival. History rarely tells it directly, but it has left hints in letters, on tombstones, and in the very structure of army life. So could you survive under these conditions? Walk hundreds of kilometers with a 40-kilogram load on your shoulders? Survive a winter in a tent on the border with barbarian lands? Keep your wits about you as your comrades are executed for cowardice? Stay tuned to the end and you'll learn why a march was scarier than a battle, how the most brutal punishment system in history worked, what a legionnaire actually ate, why a wound was almost a death sentence, and how in this hell of steel and mud, soldiers managed to find family, loyalty, and even love. This is not a story about conquests. It is a story about the price paid for them. Forget the battles. The basis of the Roman soldier's life, its daily, grueling reality, was the march. The march wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was a ritual of endurance, a test of strength that weeded out the weak before they even saw the enemy. A standard day's crossing was about 30 kilometers at a normal pace, and up to 37 kilometers at an accelerated pace. And this was not on smooth asphalt, but on dusty roads, rocky paths, or viscous mud in any weather. But the worst thing was not the distance, but the load. Each legionary carried a personal burden weighing 45 kilograms. Imagine this load. In addition to his armor, helmet, shield, and sword, the soldier carried all his possessions on a long pole. 2 weeks of grain, about 15 koitern, a kettle for cooking, a pick, a shovel, 2 wooden piles for building fences, personal belongings, a change of clothes, and a flask with water or wine. The weight was digging into his shoulders, rubbing bloody calluses. The strap of the shield cut his arm, and the helmet was a fiery furnace in the heat. Every step was an effort. Dust clogged his nose and throat. Sweat flooded his eyes. In summer, the unbearable heat and the risk of heat stroke. In winter, the piercing wind and freezing rain turned the tunic into a wet, cold rag. After a whole day of such a march, there was no rest. When the legionaries arrived at their lodging place, they immediately began to build a fortified camp. They dug a ditch, built a rampart, and erected a pile of the very piles they had been carrying all day. Only then, in total darkness, exhausted to the limit, could they pitch their tents and prepare a meager dinner. And so, day after day, week after week, it was on the march that the essence of army brotherhood was manifested. Soldiers helped each other. The stronger could take a part of the load from a weakened comrade. They shared the last sip of water. They pitched a tent together. Whoever fell from fatigue knew that he would be lifted up by the arms of his tent mates. Under these conditions, an intimacy was born that is impossible in civilian life. When you see your comrade wiping his feet in blood, but continuing to walk so as not to let the others down, it creates a bond stronger than steel. And that shared pain, shared by 8 men, was the glue that held the legion together. The march was the legionaries' first and foremost enemy. It exhausted body and spirit, turning a man into a beast of burden, and many could not endure it. But those who survived became a single organism, ready for anything. And yet even this physical torture was not as terrible as the psychological pressure. After all, any show of weakness was punished, and the Iron Order was maintained not by glory, but by fear. The Roman army was famous for its discipline, but this order was not the result of patriotism or loyalty, but of a system of punishment so brutal that fear of one's centurion was stronger than fear of the enemy. The soldier lived in constant tension, knowing that the slightest mistake, falling asleep at his post, losing his weapon, showing cowardice, could cost him his life. Punishments were varied in public to serve as a lesson to others. For minor offenses, a soldier could be deprived of part of his pay, put to humiliating labor, such as cleaning latrines, or forced to stand outside the centurion's tent all night. A more severe punishment was flogging. The centurion carried a vine stick, a symbol of his power. He could beat any soldier half to death with this stick for disobedience or slowness. But the real horror was collective punishment. If a unit showed cowardice in battle, it could be decimated. It's a word that still gives me the shivers. A cohort would be lined up, drawn lots, and every 10th soldier would be stoned or caned to death by his comrades. 9 men killed one of their own to show that the cowardice of the entire squad was a betrayal washed away only by blood. Imagine the psychological state of the soldiers forced to execute their friends with whom they shared a tent and food. Another death sentence was beating with sticks. If a sentry fell asleep at his post, endangering the whole camp, he suffered a terrible fate. His comrades would line up in 2 rows, forming a corridor, and pelt him with sticks and stones as he tried to run through the formation. It was almost impossible to survive. This constant fear created a special atmosphere. Soldiers depended on each other not only in battle, but also in everyday life. If one soldier made a mistake, they could all be punished. Therefore, within the tent fraternity, or Contouium, there was mutual assistance bordering on mutual responsibility. They covered each other, helped each other, warned of danger. The centurion was to them an external hostile force, while true loyalty belonged to the 8 men with whom you shared your life. This double morality, ostentatious obedience to officers and sincere loyalty to their own, was the basis of survival. In these conditions, any act of humanity from a comrade, a word of encouragement, an extended flask, help in cleaning weapons before review, was worth its weight in gold. Sometimes this male friendship grew into something more. Tombstones sometimes contain epitaphs where one soldier mourns his truest comrade or soul brother with a tenderness that goes beyond simple friendship. In a world where death was so close and tenderness was in short supply, people clung to each other as their only salvation. Discipline kept the legion in line, but it also burned out the humanity of the soldiers, leaving either fear or cold rage. And to keep this machine running, it had to be fed. The fuel the legionnaires received, however, was as harsh and joyless as their service. The Roman legionary ate not for pleasure, but for survival. His diet was extremely functional, caloric, and most importantly, woefully monotonous. The basis of everything was grain, most often wheat. Each soldier received his own ration and had to take care of its preparation. The main dish was thick porridge, similar to plebeian pulse, or coarse army bread, the so-called soldier's dry bread. These were essentially hard, dried flatbreads that could be kept for weeks. To eat such bread, it had to be soaked in water, wine, or chowder. It was almost impossible to chew it dry, and it was the staple food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day, year after year. Meat was rare. Most often, it was salted pork or bacon, which was given to keep up the strength. Fresh meat was available only after a successful hunt or if the army requisitioned livestock from the local population. Sometimes, as an incentive, a bull could be slaughtered for sacrifice, and the meat was distributed to the soldiers. But beans and lentils were the main source of protein. Vegetables depended on the terrain and the time of year. If the legion was camped for a long time, The soldiers planted vegetable gardens and grew cabbage, onions, garlic, and turnips. Garlic was especially valued because it was believed to give strength and protect against disease. But the legionaries' main drink was not water, but an acidic wine drink called pasca. It was a mixture of vinegar or sour wine diluted with water. Pasca was an excellent thirst quencher, cheap, and most importantly, acetic acid had antiseptic properties, which helped disinfect questionable water from rivers and wells and prevent intestinal infections, which were the scourge of any army. The taste of this drink was, to put it mildly, a bit amateurish, but it saved lives. Cooking took place within the framework of the 8 soldiers. They shared one common pot, they ground grain together with hand millstones, cooked porridge together, and shared the meager supplies together. This shared dinner was an essential social ritual. By the fire, after a hard day's work, they could talk, joke, share news. Over a shared meal, a sense of family was born. It was here, passing each other a piece of bread or a ladle of broth, that soldiers from different parts of the empire became brothers. And in this cramped tent, smelling of smoke and sweat, the simple act of eating together was a reminder that they were still human beings, not just cogs in a war machine. This meager diet sustained the physical strength, but hardly pleased the soul, and any illness or wounding on the background of such a diet could be fatal. For what awaited the wounded soldier was another circle of hell. In the minds of many, the Roman army had advanced medicine. And indeed, there were military hospitals, there were army doctors who could perform quite complex operations. But the reality for the common soldier was much darker. To get on the operating table with an experienced surgeon was a great fortune. More often than not, first aid was provided right on the battlefield, and it was brutal and primitive. Imagine being wounded. An arrowhead stabs into the body, a spear pierces the thigh, or a sword leaves a deep laceration. There are no antiseptics. The main task is to stop the blood and remove the foreign object. The wound was washed with wine or the same sprinkle, cauterized with a red-hot iron to stop bleeding, and tightly bandaged. The pain was unbearable, and there was no anesthesia except a large dose of wine. If the wound required amputation, it was a real torture. The limb was tied with a tourniquet, and the doctor sawed it off with a special bone saw. The death rate from pain shock and blood loss was enormous. But even if the operation was successful, the main battle began with infection. Dirt, lack of hygiene, and flies all caused wounds to almost always fester. Gangrene was common. A soldier could survive a battle, endure surgery, but die a week later in fever and agony from blood poisoning. Doctors used spider webs for bandages, wine lotions, and various herbs, but all were ineffective against bacteria. But even wounds were not the main killer. Disease was the scourge of the legions. Soldiers lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Epidemics of dysentery, typhoid, smallpox were constantly breaking out in the camps. Contaminated water, poor nutrition, constant stress, and overwork undermined immunity. One epidemic could wipe out a third of a legion faster than any battle. In this situation, the care of a sick or wounded comrade fell on the shoulders of his tent mates. It was they who brought him water, dressed his wounds as best they could, fed him from a spoon if he could not eat himself. They sat by his bedside at night, warding off flies and wetting his forehead. To lose a man from one of the 8 was like losing a part of oneself, and when a comrade died, it was they who gathered up his modest belongings, piled on a modest tombstone, and saw him off on his last journey. This closeness in the face of death was absolute. Their world was fragile, and they clung desperately to each other. Surviving a serious wound or illness was a miracle. And this miracle often depended not on medicine, but on the strength of the body and the care of comrades. But even if a soldier remained in the ranks, another invisible war awaited him, the war against poverty. Soldiering was not a way to get rich. It was at best a way for an ordinary legionary not to starve to death. The salary was modest and paid irregularly, 3 or 4 times a year. And most importantly, mandatory deductions were made from this sum. The soldier had to pay for most of his equipment himself, except maybe the first set of armor. Lost your sword? Buy a new one. Worn out a soldier's sandals? Pay up. You want a better cloak? Splurge. Food was also deducted from the pay. Grain, wine, bacon, none of it was free. In addition, there was a compulsory mutual aid fund, a kind of funeral fund. Each soldier contributed a part of his money to this fund so that in case of his death, his comrades could organize a decent funeral for him and place a tombstone. As a result, the legionnaire was left with a pittance on his hands. This money was barely enough for small expenses, to repair equipment, to buy something at the local market, to send a few coins to his family, if he had any. Many soldiers lived constantly in debt, borrowing money from their centurions or more fortunate comrades at interest. Debt was another chain that chained them to their service. The only chance to improve their financial situation was war booty. After a successful battle or the capture of a city, soldiers were allowed to plunder. They could take valuables, weapons, and most importantly, slaves. The captives were sold and the money was divided among the legionaries. It was the hope of booty that was the main motivation in battle. It was a bloody lottery. You could either die or, if you were lucky, get a sum equal to a year's salary. Financial matters were also decided within the 8 soldiers. They could keep a common budget, contribute money for food or equipment. If one soldier did not have enough money for new sandals, the others could help him. They lent each other money without interest, knowing that tomorrow they might need help themselves. It was an informal economic partnership based on complete trust. In their world, where every denarius counted, sharing money was the ultimate expression of friendship. The soldier was poor. He served not for money but for the promise of a better life at the end of his journey. But that end had to be reached. And most of that journey was not war, but grueling, monotonous work that broke the spirit as well as the enemy's sword. Contrary to popular images, most of his 25 years of service as a legionnaire was not spent in battle. Battles were rare, bloody blips in an ocean of monotonous, grueling labor. The Roman army was not only a force for conquest, but also the empire's chief engineering and construction resource. When the legion wasn't fighting or on the march, it was working. Soldiers built roads that still remain in Europe today. They built bridges, aqueducts, and dug canals to drain swamps. They built frontier fortifications such as the famous Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a titanic structure of stone and earth stretching for tens of kilometers. The work was physically demanding and incredibly boring. Day after day, under the scorching sun or the freezing rain, soldiers dug into the ground with pickaxes and shovels, dragged stones, and kneaded clay. This was slave labor, but it was performed by free citizens, the soldiers of Rome. Discipline at such work was as strict as in battle. Failure to fulfill the norm was punished by flogging. This routine was killing morale. Soldiers who dreamed of glory and booty turned into builders and diggers. Boredom was a constant companion. To diversify their lives, they played dice, although gambling was forbidden, carved figures out of wood, and organized fistfights. Any amusement was worth its weight in gold. In this atmosphere of monotony and fatigue, the salvation was once again the fellowship within the 8. They worked side by side, cheering each other up with jokes and rough songs. In the evening, sitting around the campfire, they told stories of home, of women, of past battles. These conversations were the only thing that saved them from homesickness. Boredom experienced together brought them closer together than fear experienced together. They knew everything about each other, who snored, who dreamed of whom, who was afraid of thunderstorms. This everyday intimacy set the stage for the deepest affection. Away from family, away from normal life, these 8 people became each other's whole world. They were brothers, fathers, sons, and sometimes the only partners in a life of hardship. It was in this gray, bleak routine that the invisible bond that made their tent fraternity a true family was forged. And this family was all the more important because, by law, a legionnaire was denied the right to another, official family. This isolated him from the civilian world and made the army ties even stronger. A legionary's entire life was built around his Contouium, the 8 soldiers who shared a single leather tent. It was the smallest tactical and administrative unit of the legion, but for the soldier, it was everything. In civilian life, the basis of society was the family. In the army, it was replaced by the Contouium. These 8 men were together 24 hours a day. They slept together in a cramped tent with barely enough room to stretch their legs. They ate from the same cauldron together. They marched together, carrying common equipment such as handheld millstones to grind grain. They worked together, digging ditches and building walls, and they went into battle together, covering each other in the ranks. They knew each other better than they knew their own brothers. This total forced intimacy created incredibly strong emotional bonds. In this enclosed male world of stress, violence, and fear, tent mates became the only outlet. They shared their deepest thoughts, fears, hopes. They cared for each other when someone was sick, supported each other when someone was down. It was in the Contouium that the theme of same-sex love in the Roman army was most pronounced. Although Roman society in general had a difficult attitude towards such liaisons, in an army where men were separated from women for decades, it was a fact of life. A strong, monogamous relationship between two soldiers was not out of the ordinary. Such a union, based on loyalty and mutual support, was not condemned and often even respected as long as it was not flaunted and did not violate the chain of command. Such a couple became the nucleus of their eight. Their relationship was known to their comrades and was taken for granted. They cared for each other with special tenderness, shared a bed, and kept a common household. In the event of the death of one, the other could remain inconsolable for the rest of his days. On the tombstones of fallen legionaries, one sometimes finds epitaphs left by their comrades, full of such personal grief that it clearly goes beyond ordinary friendship. "To my most faithful comrade and soul," reads one such inscription. This alliance wasn't just a romance, it was a survival strategy. To have someone you trusted absolutely, who would fight for you to the last breath and take care of you if you were wounded, was priceless. In a world where life was worthless, such loyalty was the only treasure. Contouium was a microcosm in which the soldiers recreated for themselves a world with its own laws, rituals, and family ties. And this informal family was more important to them than official orders and imperial laws, one of which made them outcasts in their own society. For most of the classical period of the empire, roughly from the late 1st century BCE to the late 2nd century CE, Roman soldiers were legally forbidden to enter into formal, legal marriages while in service. This law was introduced so that the soldier would be totally devoted to the army and not be burdened by family concerns. He was to be mobile, not tied to one place. His only family was to be the legion. But human nature cannot be overridden by law. Soldiers, especially those who served in garrisons on the empire's borders, developed relationships with local women. Around the large military camps, entire camp villages sprouted up, where traders, artisans, and unofficial families of legionnaires lived. These unions had no legal force. The woman was not considered a legitimate wife, and the children born of such a union were not considered legitimate heirs. They were considered illegitimate and did not receive Roman citizenship by birthright. This created a great deal of personal tragedy and put the soldier in a difficult position. He loved his woman, raised his children, but could not pass on to them his name, his property, or his status. Their whole family life was in limbo. He lived in the barracks and his family lived outside the walls of the fort. He could only see them when he was off duty. He was responsible for them, but could give them no legal protection. This situation further reinforced the importance of the army brotherhood. Tent mates knew about his unofficial family, helping them if they had the opportunity. If a soldier died, his friends could take care of his woman and children. But more often than not, such families were left without any support. It is in this context that it becomes clearer why, for many soldiers, a stable relationship with a comrade in arms was preferable. Such an alliance did not require interaction with the outside civilian world. It existed within the closed system of the army and was understood and accepted in this environment. It did not create legal problems with inheritance or the status of children. It was a relationship of equals, two people living under the same laws and sharing the same fate. The prohibition of marriage was another factor that made the soldier's life hard and unfair. He served Rome, defended its borders, but Rome itself deprived him of one of his most basic human rights, the right to a family. This detachment from normal life, this legal and social isolation, superimposed on the daily horrors of war, created an unbearable psychological pressure. We talk a lot about physical wounds, but we forget about mental wounds. The Roman soldier lived in a state of permanent stress and trauma. Modern psychology would call it post-traumatic stress disorder complex. Imagine a life filled with violence. You see a spear pierce your friend before your eyes. You kill yourself, chopping with a sword, seeing the blood and hearing the screams of the dying. You engage in brutal reprisals, burning villages and killing civilians. You see your comrades executed before your eyes. This could not go unnoticed. Roman sources are full of descriptions of battle madness, or, on the contrary, apathy and stupor in veterans. Soldiers suffered from nightmares, outbursts of uncontrollable rage and anxiety. Many drowned their fear and memories in wine. Drunkenness in the army was a serious problem. The ancients had no concept of psychotherapy. It was believed that a man, and even more so a warrior, should be stoic and bear all hardships in silence. Showing weakness, tears, complaints, all this was despised. The soldier was left alone with his demons. The only salvation was to speak out, and he could do that only among his own people, in the tent, with his comrades. Only they could understand his pain, because they had experienced the same thing. They remembered the fallen together, hated the enemy together, cursed their fate together. These nightly conversations around the campfire were their only form of therapy. The support of a comrade was invaluable. When one of them was having nightmares, the other could just sit next to him, put his hand on his shoulder. This silent support, this knowledge that you were not alone, helped to keep you sane. In relationships where two people were especially close, this mutual psychological support became the foundation of their union. They were not only lovers or friends, but also psychotherapists for each other, helping to heal invisible wounds. Psychological trauma was as much a part of soldiers' lives as calluses on their feet. It haunted them even after their service. Many veterans could not adapt to civilian life. They were too rough, too used to violence, too haunted by the ghosts of the past. Their whole life was a long, agonizing struggle for survival, physical and mental. And the only reward, the only light at the end of this 25-year tunnel, was the hope for a decent old age. But even this hope often turned out to be just a mirage. After 25 years of service, a soldier would receive an honorable discharge. This was the very moment for which he had endured all the hardships. As a pension, the veteran received either a large lump sum of money or, more often, a plot of land for farming. In addition, he and his children received full Roman citizenship. This was the main lure for recruits from the provinces. On paper, everything looked fine. But in reality, resignation often brought new disappointments. The cash payment could be delayed for years, especially in times of political instability or a crisis in the treasury. Sometimes its value was eaten up by inflation. Land was not always a gift either. Often veterans were given land in uninhabited frontier areas. This land had to be developed, uproot the forest, plow the virgin land, and build a house. For a 45-year-old man whose health had been compromised by decades of service and injuries, it was hard for him to start his life as a farmer from scratch. Many could not cope, sold their plots for nothing and left for the cities, joining the ranks of the poor. But the main problem was social adaptation. After 25 years in the closed, militarized world of the army, it was difficult for a veteran to fit into civilian life. He was used to orders, to a clear hierarchy, to violence as a way of solving problems. Peaceful life seemed alien and incomprehensible to him. His neighbors often feared and shunned these rough, scarred men with hard eyes. Many veterans continued to live together. They settled in colonies, creating their own communities where army laws and notions of honor applied. They helped each other, as they were accustomed to doing in the Legion. Often two soldiers who had served together all their service would buy land for two and farm it together for the rest of their lives, remaining faithful to their army alliance. It was the only way for them to keep the usual peace. Retirement was the end of one nightmare, but often the beginning of another. The soldier gave Rome his youth, his health, his soul, and in return received only a phantom chance for a peaceful old age. His journey was a story not of triumph, but of survival, where each new day was a victory. The life of a Roman soldier, if we peel away the gilding of imperial propaganda, appears to us as a severe test of the limits of human capabilities. It was not a series of glorious victories, but 25 years of monotonous labor, humiliation, fear, pain, and loneliness. Endless marches, brutal discipline, meager food, the constant risk of death from injury or disease. financial insecurity, and psychological trauma? These were what a legionnaire's life really consisted of. He was not a hero, but a cog in a ruthless machine, fueled by his strength and his life. And yet, even in these inhuman conditions, the soldiers managed to retain their humanity. Their salvation became a brotherhood, born in mud and blood, their tent brotherhood. The 8 comrades sharing a tent became a real family for them. It was here, in this tight cell, that they found support, loyalty, and even love. Sharing the last dry bread, dressing each other's wounds, covering each other in battle, they created their own world, with its own laws and values. In these relationships, which sometimes went beyond friendship and became lifelong alliances, was their main victory, the victory over despair. The story of the Roman soldier is not the story of how empires were conquered. It is a story of how a man is able to endure when everything has been taken from him except the shoulder of the comrade beside him. It is a hymn not to glory, but to endurance. If you are interested in immersing yourself in this harsh reality, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, what other hidden side of life in ancient Rome would you like to uncover? Perhaps the secret life of Vestal women, the life of gladiators behind the walls of the arena, or the secrets of Roman spies. After all, history is always much more complicated than it seems at first glance.